Whoever has a why to live can endure almost anyhow. With this phrase, Nietzsche invites us to see suffering as something beyond a mere experience of pain. But can suffering be beautiful? Can it shape our essence in a way that makes us more authentic, more human? Imagine a sculptor standing before a raw block of marble. Each strike of the chisel, every fragment that falls to the ground, seems like a violent process. And yet, it is through this destruction that a masterpiece emerges. Nietzsche believed that human life was no different. For him, suffering is not just a part of existence. It is what makes us magnificent. In this video, we will explore how the German philosopher saw suffering as a creative force, a bridge to transformation. Why did Nietzsche believe it was necessary to embrace pain? And, most importantly, what does this mean for our lives today? To understand what Nietzsche thought about suffering, we need to dive into his philosophical context. Nietzsche, known for his revolutionary ideas and for questioning the foundations of morality and religion, lived during a time marked by crises of meaning. The advancement of science and the decline of religious traditions led Nietzsche to declare that God is dead. This statement was not a celebration but an observation that the Western world had lost its spiritual center. Without a God to dictate the meaning of life, man needed to find a new purpose. In this existential void, Nietzsche believed that suffering could become a catalyst for the creation of meaning. Instead of fleeing from pain, he challenged us to face it head-on and transform it into a driving force for our evolution. This is where the concept of amor fati, or love of fate, comes into play. For Nietzsche, loving fate meant accepting life in its entirety, with its pains and pleasures, as something beautiful and necessary. It is not about resignation, but about embracing pain as an integral part of the process of becoming something greater. For example, consider how great artists, writers, and inventors often drew their most significant works from moments of intense personal pain. For Nietzsche, this was no coincidence. He saw suffering as an invitation to transcendence, as fertile ground for creating something sublime. At this point, the question arises, what should we do with suffering? Should we flee from it or use it as fuel to reinvent ourselves? This is where the figure of the Overman comes in, which we will explore in the next chapter. Nietzsche introduced the concept of the Übermensch, or Superman, as a metaphor for the human being who transcends limitations and continually reinvents themselves. However, this transformation does not occur in a state of comfort or happiness. It requires a direct confrontation with suffering. For Nietzsche, the Superman is not someone who denies or avoids pain, but someone who uses it as a tool to shape their essence. They are the sculptor of their own identity, carving it out of the adversities they face. Just as extreme heat transforms coal into diamond, suffering can transform an ordinary individual into something extraordinary. A clear example of this idea lies in the metaphor of the path from camel to lion and finally to child, presented in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The camel represents submission and the passive acceptance of life's burdens. The lion, on the other hand, symbolizes rebellion and the destruction of old beliefs. But it is the child that represents true transcendence, the ability to create something new, free from resentment and the limitations imposed by the past. Pain, therefore, is a necessary passage in this process. It is in the struggle against despair, fear, and doubt that the human being discovers their creative strength. Nietzsche saw suffering as the great alchemical furnace of the soul, where impurities are burned away and something purer emerges. In practice, we can see this idea reflected in our own lives. Think of a moment of great difficulty you faced. Perhaps it was a loss, a failure, or a disillusionment. Now ask yourself, what did you learn from that experience? How has it shaped who you are today? The Superman is not merely someone who survives these moments, but someone who transforms them into fuel for growth. This perspective leads us to the next topic, the aesthetics of suffering and the idea that pain, far from being purely destructive, can also be beautiful. Nietzsche saw life as a work of art in constant creation, with suffering as the raw material of this masterpiece. To him, pain was not merely an obstacle, it was an essential ingredient in the process of becoming. But how can suffering be transformed into something beautiful? This is where the concept of the aesthetics of suffering comes into play. Just as an artist shapes chaos into form, an individual can transform their pain into growth, into something meaningful. Nietzsche, inspired by the Greek tragedians, believed that beauty does not lie in the absence of suffering, but in how we face and integrate it into our lives. In Greek tragedy, characters confront their dreadful fates with dignity and courage, creating a spectacle that not only inspires but also evokes in us a sense of profound beauty. This is what Nietzsche referred to as the Dionysian spirit, a celebration of life in its entirety with all its contradictions, joy and pain, creation and destruction. This idea is also reflected in Nietzsche's own life. He endured decades of debilitating health problems, loneliness, and the rejection of his ideas during his lifetime. Yet it was on this barren ground that he cultivated some of the most profound reflections in Western philosophy. He did not merely endure suffering, he transformed it into his own philosophical art. For us, this perspective can be deeply liberating. Imagine pain as a lump of clay in your hands. You can leave it shapeless, heavy and useless, or you can mold it into something imbued with deeper meaning. This doesn't mean romanticizing pain, but rather acknowledging its creative potential. Nietzsche challenges us to see our wounds not as shameful scars, but as marks of battles that have made us stronger, more authentic. After all, those who have suffered deeply can perceive nuances in life that those living in constant comfort may never understand. With this in mind, we might ask ourselves, how do Nietzsche's ideas apply to the modern world? In the next chapter, we will explore how his view of suffering resonates with contemporary concepts such as resilience and overcoming adversity. In today's world, Nietzsche's view of suffering might seem radical, especially in a society that often seeks to avoid pain at all costs. We are constantly bombarded with messages that associate happiness with consumption, comfort, and the pursuit of a life free of difficulties. But does this vision of easy happiness really make us stronger? Nietzsche's philosophy resonates with modern concepts like resilience, the ability to overcome adversity and grow from it. Psychological research shows that people who face and process their pain in a healthy way tend to develop greater emotional intelligence, empathy, and mental strength. This does not mean glorifying suffering, but rather recognizing that it is inevitable, and that our choices in response to it determine the impact it will have on our lives. For instance, think of the great stories of overcoming adversity in history. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, who emerged stronger after years of imprisonment, or artists who turned devastating losses into masterpieces. These journeys are evidence that pain can be a catalyst for creating something profoundly meaningful. In everyday life, this is reflected in our own stories. A professional failure, the end of a relationship, or a health crisis may seem unbearable in the moment. Yet, over time, we often realize that these experiences taught us valuable lessons, broadened our worldview, and made us more resilient. Positive psychology, which emphasizes post-traumatic growth, also reflects this idea. Studies show that for many people, painful events become turning points, moments that redefine their values and priorities, helping them live more authentically. This is essentially amor fati, in action in the contemporary world. When we apply this Nietzschean perspective to our own lives, we move away from the temptation to seek an existence free of suffering, and instead ask ourselves, how can I use this experience to become the best version of myself? Finally, Nietzsche reminds us that pain is a creative force, not an end in itself. It is a step, not the destination. This is his invitation to each of us, to use suffering as a tool to rise above our circumstances. In the next and final chapter, we will reflect on why, for Nietzsche, suffering can be our greatest ally and how we can incorporate this perspective into our lives. Nietzsche offers us a challenging yet profoundly transformative perspective. Suffering, far from being an enemy to be avoided, is a powerful ally in our journey of self-discovery and growth. To him, pain is like a blacksmith's fire, purifying and strengthening the metal, shaping it into something more beautiful and resilient. This perspective invites us to abandon the pursuit of an easy life and embrace the complexity of existence. Suffering is not beautiful in itself, but it can become beautiful when we use it to grow, create, and find meaning. True human greatness lies in this process, not in avoiding pain, but in transforming it into a driving force for overcoming obstacles. Think about the most challenging moments in your life. They likely brought lessons that no comfortable situation could have provided. This is what Nietzsche sought to teach us. Suffering reveals who we are, and more importantly, shows us who we can become. The philosopher did not see suffering as a condemnation, but as an opportunity. He believed that each of us has the ability to transcend difficulties and reinvent ourselves, much like the Overman he envisioned. In the end, it is how we choose to face our challenges that determines the quality of our lives. We leave you with this reflection. What if, instead of resisting suffering, you faced it as a sculptor faces their block of marble? What form could you carve from the adversities you encounter? As Nietzsche said, become who you are. This is the true essence of his philosophy, and perhaps the key to transforming pain into beauty, difficulty into power, and life into art. You've made it to the end, and that tells me something profound about you. Not everyone chooses to dive so deeply into ideas that provoke, question, and sometimes even unsettle. It feels like we're having a conversation by a fireplace, with life's big questions dancing between us like the flames. And you know, as Nietzsche reminds us that pain can sculpt something extraordinary within us, I can't help but think how this applies to you, staying with me until the very end. It's as if, by listening about suffering and the Overman, you might be carving something new within yourself, a thought, a perspective, or maybe even the first step towards something greater. I remember a time in my life during a difficult moment when I stumbled upon this idea of loving one's fate, amor fati. At the time, it didn't make much sense. It felt more like a challenge than advice. But over time, I realized that every blow life dealt was actually an invitation to become stronger, more authentic. And now, sharing this with you feels like closing a circle. So thank you. Thank you for dedicating your time, your mind, and perhaps even a piece of your heart to be here. I hope these words resonate within you, inspiring something that may still be dormant, but is ready to awaken. And if this journey made sense to you, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment, share what moved you. Who knows, our exchange of ideas might just spark something even greater. You're not alone on this journey, and as Nietzsche would say, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. May your why shine ever brighter. See you next time.